Hi, this is Matt Baker. Today I'm going to show you the family tree of Ukrainian and Russian monarchs, all the way from the Viking leader Rurik, who lived about 1200 years ago, to the Romanov Emperor Nicholas II, who died in 1918. Now, some people aren't going to like the fact that I used both Ukrainian and Russian in the title of this video, especially considering that these two countries are currently at war. However, the truth of the matter is that both Ukraine and Russia share a common origin, and in fact, the dynasty that went on to rule Russia was originally based in Kiev, meaning that the early monarchs on this tree are as much Ukrainian as they are Russian. In this video, I'll be using the latest version of my European royal family tree north/east chart, which you can buy as a poster by going to usefulcharts.com or by clicking the link in the description or pinned comment. The first dynasty we'll be looking at is the Rurikid dynasty, which is named after its legendary founder, Rurik, who was the leader of a people known as the Varangians, or Rus. Now, there's some debate over who exactly the Rus were. The majority view is that they were Normans, aka Vikings, who settled in what is today Ukraine and Russia, where they were eventually absorbed into the mostly Slavic population there. According to medieval accounts, the original Slavic tribes were constantly fighting amongst themselves. So in order to solve this problem, they invited some foreign princes over from what is today Sweden to serve as their new neutral rulers. 3 Varangian princes were sent, but only one survived, and his name was Rurik. Now, interestingly, the name Rurik is simply the Old Norse equivalent of the English name Roderick and the Spanish name Rodrigo, both of which simply mean famous ruler. So it's likely that this very old story is more legend than actual history. But nonetheless, the mainstream view is that the Rurikids and the Rus did in fact start out as foreign rulers, but then eventually got absorbed into the general Slavic population. The other option, held mostly by those who want an origin story that fits better with their nationalistic ideology, is that the Rus were of Slavic origin to begin with. Now, the first settlement established by the Rus was Novgorod, which simply means new city. However, their base of power quickly moved south to Kiev, where Rurik's successor, Oleg the Wise, established what would become known as the Principality of Kievan Rus. Oleg was only a proxy ruler, though, serving as regent until Rurik's son Igor was ready to rule. The Rus, under both Oleg and Igor, were powerful enough that they were able to attack Constantinople several times and force the Byzantines to pay them tribute. However, while collecting tribute from a closer, much smaller neighbor, Igor was assassinated, which left his wife Olga in charge, as their son Sviatoslav was just an infant at the time. Olga got revenge for her husband's death, and in doing so expanded Kievan Rus's territory. But more importantly, she traveled to Constantinople during the reign of Emperor Constantine VII, where she converted to Christianity. Because of this, she was later made a saint, and to this day is a highly revered figure within the Orthodox Church. She was not, however, able to convert the Rus people as a whole. This would not occur until the reign of her grandson, Vladimir the Great. But before this, Sviatoslav I made Kievan Rus even bigger by conquering the Khazar Khaganate to the east and invading the Bulgars to the south. However, while returning from battle against the Bulgars, he was assassinated by the Byzantines, who would go on to conquer Bulgaria for themselves. This threw Kievan Rus into civil war, with the 2 eldest sons, Yaropolk and Oleg, who is not shown on the chart, fighting over who would take the throne. First, Yaropolk killed Oleg, but then, surprise, surprise, Sviatoslav's third and illegitimate son, Vladimir, killed Yaropolk, and thus it was he who became the next major ruler, eventually becoming known as Vladimir the Great, although in Ukraine he's known as Volodymyr the Great. So interestingly, Putin and Zelensky actually have the same name, both of their first names being traced back to this guy. Now, like I said, Vladimir the Great is mostly remembered for becoming a Christian. Why he did this is debated, but it may have been so that he could marry Anna, the sister of the great Byzantine Emperor Basil II. Whatever the reason, he basically went on to convert his entire country to Orthodox Christianity, and is nowadays the one credited for having built the St. Sophia Cathedral, Kyiv's most famous landmark. After Vladimir the Great's death, there was yet another civil war, with several sons vying for power. Initially, Svyatopolk I captured the throne by killing his brothers Boris and Gleb, who were later sainted as martyrs. But then Svyatopolk was defeated by Yaroslav the Wise, under whose reign medieval Kyiv reached its peak, both in terms of size as well as culture. For instance, he issued the Ruskaya Pravda, the earliest law code for the Rus. He's also one of the most interesting people on the tree in terms of how he connects to other royal dynasties. First, there's the fact that his mother may have been Anna of Constantinople. This has not been proven definitively, but if true, it means that all of Yaroslav's descendants can be directly linked to the Eastern Roman emperors, as far back as Michael II. And Yaroslav's descendants, well, they eventually spread to every royal family in Europe. That's because he married at least 3 of his daughters to other kings. Most notable of these was Anne, shown here on our European royal family tree West chart, as the wife of Henry I of France, a very early member of the House of Capet. Yaroslav the Wise may also have been the father of Agatha, the wife of Edward the Exile of England. Together, they had Margaret of Wessex, who had Matilda of Scotland, who was a progenitor of the House of Plantagenet. But back to Kievan Rus. After the death of Yaroslav the Wise, his 3 surviving sons initially split the land and ruled together peacefully. But eventually, fighting broke out between the brothers and between their heirs, and things didn't really settle down until Vladimir II came to the throne. He's also known as Vladimir Monomach because he married a Byzantine princess who was either the daughter or close relative of Emperor Constantine IX from the Monomachus family. Constantine IX supposedly gave Vladimir this crown, known as Monomach's cap, but it's more likely that the crown actually originated several centuries later, during the Mongol era. Anyhow, Vladimir II married Geitha, the daughter of Harold Godwinson, who was briefly King of England before losing the Battle of Hastings to William the Conqueror. Together, Geitha and Vladimir were the parents of Mstislav the Great, who was the last ruler of a united Kievan Rus, before it fragmented into a bunch of smaller states, ruled by different branches of the Rurik dynasty. The 2 main branches were the one that descended from Mstislav's son Izyaslav, and the branch that descended from Mstislav's half-brother Yuri. And this is where the history of Ukraine and the history of Russia take different paths. Which brings me to the words Ruthenia and Russia, both of which are based on the word Rus. As you already know, Rus was another term for the Varangians, who were originally Vikings. In fact, in the Old Norse language, Rus simply meant those who row. Well, Ruthenia is the Latin version of Rus, and Russia is the Greek version. Because the area that is now Ukraine is located closer to Catholic Europe, and for many years was part of Poland-Lithuania, it was often referred to as Ruthenia, whereas the areas further north and east, which were firmly in Greek Orthodox territory, became known as Russia. As for the word Ukraine, well, it simply means borderlands, which makes sense considering that it is on the border between the East Slavs, who mostly follow Orthodox Christianity, and the West Slavs, who mostly follow Catholicism. Okay, back to the family tree. It was the descendants of Izyaslav II who were based in what is today Ukraine. Initially, 2 separate principalities developed there, called Halitsky and Volonia. But then Izyaslav II's grandson, Roman the Great, managed to unite them, becoming the most powerful of the Rurikid princes. However, when he died, there was a very long war over who would take control of his territory, with both Poland and Hungary trying to capture it. To complicate matters, that war also coincided with the arrival of the Mongols, who captured Kiev in 1240. Eventually, Roman's son Daniel was able to get a firm hold on Halitsky and Volhynia, as well as placate the Mongols. At this point, the Pope gave him the title of king, in the hopes that he would continue to ally with the Catholic kingdoms and serve as a buffer state against the Mongols. Thus, the kingdom of Halitsky-Volhynia was born, although it's also sometimes referred to as the kingdom of Ruthenia. So Daniel became the first Rus king, even though the earlier grand princes of Kiev were far more powerful. This is because the rank of king was more of a Western European thing. You see, in Catholic areas, rulers could not be promoted to the level of king unless the Pope or Holy Roman Emperor allowed it. Anyhow, Daniel was followed by his son Lev, or Leo. He moved his capital to the new city of Lviv, which was named after him. He was then followed by his son Yuri, and then after Yuri, the kingdom was ruled jointly by two brothers, Andrew and Lev II. But then, when the two brothers died in battle against the Mongols, this line of the Rurikids went extinct, and the area was eventually split between Poland and Lithuania. From there, Ukraine remained under the control of either Poland or Lithuania until the rise of a semi-independent Cossack state, which was then gradually absorbed into the Russian Empire. Okay, let's now look at the line descending from Yuri I. Whereas the Izyaslavichi line ended up ruling to the west of Kiev, the Yurievichi line ended up ruling to the north. There, the main Rus cities were Rostov and Suzdal, as well as a newer city named Vladimir, named after Yuri's father. However, Yuri founded many more settlements, including one that would later become very important, Moscow. But before the rise of Moscow, it was actually the city of Vladimir that would rise to prominence first. During the reign of Yuri I's son Svetoslav III, the area of Rostov-Suzdal became known as the Grand Principality of Vladimir. Svetoslav III had a lot of children, which is why he's nicknamed the Big Nest. But eventually, the Grand Principality of Vladimir was inherited by his fifth son, Yaroslav II. He in turn was the father of Saint Alexander Nevsky, the name Nevsky being a reference to the fact that he won the Battle of the Neva River against Sweden, an event that would later be seen as a major turning point in Russian history. Take note that he had a brother named Andrei II, who I'll be returning to later. Now, Nevsky, he had 4 sons, of which Daniel was the youngest. Daniel received Moscow as his inheritance, because at the time, Moscow was not very important. But that would quickly change, particularly under the rule of his son, Ivan I. Ivan was able to absorb several smaller principalities nearby, and by doing so, greatly increase Moscow's wealth and influence. Also useful was the fact that the main bishop of the Rus moved his headquarters from Kiev to Vladimir in 1299, and then from Vladimir to Moscow in 1326. You see, by this point, the Rurikids had lost the kingdom of Halitsky-Volhynia, so the center of the Rus world, or the Russian world as I'll be calling it from this point forward, was now firmly located in the north, where over the next few generations, Moscow would gradually replace Vladimir as the main Russian city. But there was still one major problem: the Mongols. Ever since their initial invasion in the 1230s, they had basically been the overlords of the entire area, able to decide which Russian prince ruled which city. It wasn't until Ivan the Great that Moscow was finally able to throw off their yoke and achieve true independence. Under Ivan's rule, Moscow's territory grew from this size to this size, and its ruler became known as the Grand Prince of all Russia. Ivan even started using the term Tsar, meaning Caesar, because by that point, the Eastern Roman Empire had ceased to exist. Because Russia was now the largest power within the Orthodox world, Ivan wanted Moscow to be seen as the Third Rome. To this end, he even married the niece of the final Byzantine emperor and added the Byzantine double eagles to the Russian coat of arms. It was also Ivan the Great who built the oldest structures of the Kremlin still in existence today. He was followed by his son Vasily III, who was then followed by yet another famous Ivan, the one known as Ivan the Terrible, although take note that his name likely meant something more like Ivan the Powerful rather than Ivan the Bad. He inherited Russia when he was just 3 years old, but in 1547, which is when he turned 16, he became the first Russian ruler to actually be crowned as Tsar and to have Monomach's cap placed on his head during the ceremony. Thus, 1547 is generally seen as being the year that the Tsardom of Russia came into existence. During Ivan the Terrible's reign, Russia continued to expand, but perhaps more importantly, the powers of the monarch did as well, to the point where the Tsar now held absolute power. Ivan the Terrible's first wife was Anastasia Romanovna, a fact that would become important a bit later, and together they had 2 sons, Ivan and Fyodor. Ivan was groomed to become Ivan V, but one day in a fit of rage, the Tsar struck and accidentally killed him, an event memorialized by this famous painting, and which had a profound effect on the next several decades. You see, Ivan the Terrible died just a few years later, and his throne therefore passed to Fyodor, who was physically and perhaps mentally disabled. This meant that the real ruler was his regent and brother-in-law, Boris Godunov, which sounds a lot like good enough. Fyodor didn't have any surviving children, nor did his younger brother Dmitri, who predeceased him. So when Fyodor died, Boris was named Tsar. This initiated what's known as the Time of Troubles, a period of political instability that was made even worse when a really bad famine hit, killing about a third of Russia's population. After the death of Boris, his 16-year-old son Fyodor became Fyodor II. But then 3 different men appeared, all claiming to be Dmitri, the previously assumed dead brother of Fyodor I. The first of these managed to actually become the Tsar for about a year, killing Boris's son. But then he was overthrown and replaced by Vasily IV, who was a Rurik, but from a minor branch of the dynasty. Remember this guy who I mentioned earlier? Well, his descendants became known as the House of Shuisky, and that's the house that Vasily IV belonged to. But Vasily IV was unpopular and was eventually deposed by the leading nobles. Around the same time, Polish armies captured Moscow, and for a while it seemed as though Vladislav IV might become Tsar. He was not yet king of Poland at this point, but rather the heir to his father, Sigismund III. That did not happen though, because in the end the nobles decided to elect Michael from the house of Romanov instead. His paternal grandmother was a member of the Shuisky family, and thus Michael was in fact a descendant of the Rurikids, just not through a male-only line. His paternal grandfather was also the brother of Ivan the Terrible's first wife, so there was that connection as well. Anyhow, Michael's ascension brought an end to the time of troubles. He was only 16 when his reign began, though, so it was actually his father who was the real ruler for the next 20 years. Michael, who is called Michael I, even though he's the only Michael to ever be Tsar, was followed by his son Alexis. Alexis continued to expand Russia's territory, regaining the old Rus capital of Kiev and extending the Tsardom's borders far into Siberia, all the way to the Pacific Ocean. But it was during the reigns of his 3 surviving sons, particularly the third one, that Russia truly became a great power. First came Fyodor III, who came to the throne at age 15, but only lived to be 20 due to poor health and physical disability. Ivan V was supposed to come next, but he had not only physical disabilities, but mental limitations as well. Several advisors therefore wanted him to be skipped over for Peter, who was only 10 but in good health, both physically and mentally. In the end, it was decided that they would reign together as co-monarchs. However, once Peter became of age, Ivan pretty much just faded into the background, dying in 1696 at age 29. Peter went on to become known as Peter the Great because he accomplished a lot during his reign, both militarily and administratively. He wanted Russia to become more like the other great powers of Europe, and therefore in 1721, he decided to start using the title of emperor instead of Tsar, although really the titles were basically the same, and his descendants would continue to be referred to by both. However, take note that from a historiographical perspective, the year 1721 marks the end of the Tsardom of Russia and the beginning of the Russian Empire. Peter also founded the city of St. Petersburg, which, by the way, is not named for him, but rather for St. Peter, the disciple of Jesus. The area had previously been controlled by Sweden, but he recaptured it, giving Russia access to the Baltic Sea. Peter moved his capital to St. Petersburg, and except for a few years, it remained the capital of Russia and the home of the Tsars until their fall in 1917. After that, it was briefly called Petrograd, after Peter the Great, and then Leningrad during the Soviet years, until the original name was restored in 1991. At the time Peter the Great died, he had no living sons, and therefore he was succeeded by his second wife, who became Catherine I. This was mostly the doing of Peter's good friend, Alexander Menshikov, who ended up becoming the de facto ruler until Catherine's death a few years later. After that, the throne passed to Peter the Great's only grandson at the time, the 11-year-old Peter II. But he died of illness after just 3 years, and therefore the nobles had to choose between one of Ivan V's daughters, the eldest of which was named Catherine, or Peter the Great's only surviving daughter, Elizabeth. Catherine's younger sister, Anna, was actually deemed to be the most suitable, and therefore she was the one who reigned for the next 10 years. After that, the throne passed to Catherine's grandson, Ivan VI, who had just been born. However, at this point there was a coup, a rather peaceful one though, and the supporters of Peter the Great's daughter, Elizabeth, managed to get her placed on the throne instead. Elizabeth ended up being the last true Romanov to rule Russia. That's because after her, the throne passed to her sister's son, Peter III. Because his father was from the Danish house of Holstein-Gottorp, he was technically not a Romanov, even though he and his descendants are generally referred to as being such. Interestingly, all of the czars of Russia from this point forward actually come from the exact same male line as the current British monarch, King Charles III. But Peter III, well, he reigned for just 6 months. That's because his wife, who became Catherine II, had him killed so that she could take the throne for herself, being the first to be crowned with this new crown. She ended up becoming one of Russia's most important rulers, earning the title Catherine the Great, because during her long reign, Russia experienced a renaissance in terms of culture and science. She also extended Russia's borders in the south by annexing Crimea and capturing land around the Black Sea, and in the west by basically orchestrating the demise of Poland. She was succeeded by her son Paul I, who some say was not the child of Peter III, but rather of Catherine's lover, Sergei Saltykov, something that Catherine herself hinted at, but then later denied. The Saltykov family, like the Romanovs, were also descendants of the Rurikids via a female line. So even if Paul I wasn't Peter III's son, he did have a royal roots. Paul's main accomplishment was changing the laws of succession for the Russian throne. For 67 of the last 71 years, Russia had been ruled by women, and Paul himself had been denied the throne when his father died. So he wanted to make sure this didn't happen again. According to his new rules, the throne would always pass automatically to the most senior male in the dynasty, and only ever to a female if there were no males left. The new law got to be applied earlier than he had hoped, because just 4 years into his reign, he was assassinated. The next emperor was his firstborn son, Alexander. He had the task of leading Russia through the Napoleonic Wars. However, since he had no legitimate sons, and one of his brothers had abdicated in order to marry someone below his rank, the throne next passed to his youngest brother, Nicholas. During Nicholas I's reign, the Russian Empire experienced its first major loss, that of the Crimean War. Nicholas was succeeded by his firstborn son, Alexander II, who did something that was long overdue. He abolished serfdom, which was basically a form of slavery, setting free over 23 million serfs. But by this point, there was already a growing movement in Russia of people who wanted even more reform, including getting rid of the Tsar altogether. This led to Alexander II becoming the third Romanov emperor to be assassinated, although he would not be the last. Shortly after the assassination, rumors began to spread that the killing had been primarily orchestrated by Jews, even though that was not true. This resulted in the first major pogrom. The pogroms were state-approved mob violence against Jews that included murder, rape, and the destruction of property. Because of this violence, many Jews migrated to the US over the next 40 years, which is why the US currently has the second largest population of Jews in the world today. Alexander II was followed by his son Alexander III, who in turn was followed by his son Nicholas II. It has often been noted that Nicholas II looked a lot like King George V of Great Britain. Well, that's because their mothers were sisters. However, whereas George V lived to old age, Nicholas II did not. In February of 1917, when World War I was still going on, a revolution took place in Russia, which led Nicholas II to abdicate. At this point, the imperial family was put under house arrest. Then, in October of 1917, a second revolution occurred, this time resulting in the Bolsheviks taking charge, led by Vladimir Lenin. A civil war ensued, and the imperial family was moved 2 more times before eventually being executed in July of 1918. So that brings us to the end of the family tree. If you want to find out who would be Tsar of Russia today if the monarchy were ever to be restored, we actually did a video on that previously, which I'll link to on screen as well as in the description. Thanks for watching.